A very warm welcome to our second Film Thinking event of the year. Film Thinking is a series hosted by the Kogut Institute for the Humanities with funding support this year from the Brown Arts Institute, to whom we're immensely grateful. My name is Tim Bewes. I teach in the English department here at Brown, and I'm delighted to be here with you all and with our special guests for this evening's conversation. We've been watching Bernardo Bertolucci's 1970 film, The Spider's Stratagem, made the same year as The Conformist, and thus the first of a diptych examining Italian fascism and its legacy. So the idea is we'll have a conversation lasting around an hour all told, but we'll talk for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open things up for discussion. So we're joined by Suzanne Stewart-Steinberg at the end, Professor of Italian Studies at Brown, who is on behalf of Film Thinking acting as curator for this particular film. So she selected the film for us to view. Next to her is Massimo Riva, who introduced himself earlier, also from the Department of Italian Studies, who directs the indispensable long-running annual film series Il Cinema Ritrovato on Tour here at Brown, and is also the coordinator of the Virtual Humanities Lab here. And then finally, Ben Parker from the Department of English, who teaches 19th century fiction and also writes about film for various venues, including Film Quarterly. So I would like to begin the conversation with Suzanne, who selected the film for us to watch. And Suzanne, I know you've had a long-standing interest in this period of Bertolucci's work. It has been important for your research on the Italian fascist period and its aftermath. So I wonder if you could just begin by telling us why this film in particular, why is it suitable for this particular series, and what is for you most significant about it? What is for you challenging about it? Why is this a film that makes us or helps us to think differently about cinema, or to think about cinema, or to think about history and politics?
I think that was an open question. Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Kogut Institute, and also thank you, Massimo, for making this film part of this year's film festival, Cinema Ritrovato. I chose this film because, well, number one, I love it, and I have to say, this is the first time I've seen the film on a big screen. It was made for Italian television, and when I first saw it when I was extremely young, when it came out in 1970, it was on Italian television, and then after that, the film never got distributed even on DVD, and so this has really been an extraordinary experience for me, particularly now in its restored version. So I actually teach this film together with The Conformist on a regular basis here at Brown, as part of a freshman seminar on how Italians after the war represented, on film, how fascism was represented, and the students love this film, and for I think all kinds of reasons, but some of these I would like to sort of mention briefly. And the way this works, and the way the instructions came from Tim is, we're all going to make just a couple of sort of discussion points, and then have a discussion amongst us, and then open it up to everybody else. And so I will just put out for right now, I could make a long list of things one could talk about in this film, but I'll just put out 4. And the first point I would like to make has really to do with historical context. And as you know, the film was made in 1970, and this was really a very important year, or beginning of a lengthy period in which Italian fascism after the war gets rethought. And what had dominated the scene both culturally, and at the level of popular culture and the media, but also academically, was to think about the past, going from 1922 to 1943, when Mussolini was deposed. And so what happens in Italy, Mussolini is deposed in 43, Germany, an ex-ally, is then immediately turns around and occupies Italy. So Italy is suddenly under German occupation, and the country is split in a very complicated way. Mussolini is reinstated by the Germans in the north. The Allies are moving up the boot and liberating Italy coming from the south. And the resistance, the Italian resistance, becomes active between 43 and 45, and there is, an armed uprising against the Germans, but also the, still remaining pockets of Italian fascists. Now, when the war is over in 1945, the way this history gets narrated in Italy is in terms of what it is called the myth of the resistance, or that's how it will eventually be called. Meaning that Italy tells itself, the story it tells is that Italy was occupied by the Nazis, fought the invader, the heroic resistance. Italian fascism is a minor player in comparison to German Nazism, and Mussolini was, after all, deposed, and therefore Italy has done with the fascist past. Now, this narrative of, good Italy against bad Germany and the heroic resistance, which is the basis, so it is said, of the new founded republic, Italian Republic, after the fall of the monarchy, starts crumbling in exactly the period when this film is made. And it crumbles for many reasons. It falls apart certainly as a result of the 68ers, which is the next generation, and it is a generational struggle, right? So sons and daughters begin to ask questions of their parents. This is why I think one can also say this film is so much about fathers, and where the son is interrogating the role of the father. And so questions are being asked of this myth of the resistance, namely, well, Dad, what were you doing during the war? And what was your role? So it comes partly, or, and in a very important way, from within the left as a critique of this myth. And it also, of course, takes hold in Italian historiography. And so there is a beginning of a critique of Italians' involvement in fascism. It also, however, and this is what makes it very, very complicated, this crumbling also comes about as a result of, from the right and from, the newly constituted fascist parties, as well as, more radical extreme right-wing groups who are claiming that Italy, the history of Italy as simply the heroic fight against the resistance, has left out an entire other part of the country who were not part of the resistance and who who are being drowned out in a national narrative. And so therefore there's an attempt by the right to recuperate and become part of a national narrative. And so the film, and Bertolucci makes 3 important films about the fascist legacy, this one, and then in the same year, The Conformist, and then I believe it was in 76, 1900, which is the other major, it's, 6 hours long. It's a very, very long film about, the fascist past. But here, and this sort of brings me to the second point that I want to make, which has to do with traitors and heroes, right? we get these terms because Bertolucci made the film based loosely on the story, a short story written by Borges called The Theme of the Traitor and the Hero. And so he wants to interrogate in this film the problem of the traitor. And we know now, the twist at the end of the story, of course, is that the heroism of Athos Magnani Sr. is in fact based in a very complicated way, embedded in also him being both a hero and a traitor. And I think a question that we can ask, at the so-called speech that he gives, the son gives towards the end of the film, about in the square when they are yet again unveiling another monument to his father, is he's stuck, right? There is no way out of this dilemma, because whatever he does, whatever he chooses, he will be a traitor, right? So he can betray his father by telling the truth, and in the name of presumably some kind of historical truth. But on the other hand, and we're not quite sure what he does, but he seems to not tell the truth and keep the legend going in the name, if you will, of something against fascism, and so to keep the anti-fascist narrative alive. So it's a terrible dilemma. And I think one question one can ask is, does the film actually propose a way out of the problem, right? Athos Jr. remains stuck in it, well, he does. At the end, there are no trains have passed through Tada, and he is locked into the web that has been, created for him. So I think that, that's the second point I would like to make, and then added to that the question, does the film actually give us some kind of way out of this? And then another point that I think is interesting to look at, and this has come up a lot when I teach the film, and that it has to do with, there is a kind of overwhelming amount of citation that goes on the film. It quotes constantly, and not just from other texts. We can start with the Borges text, of course, but explicitly Macbeth, and Julius Caesar, so the Shakespeare. There is the operatic repertory that is, continuously cited, particularly, of course, Verdi. And in interviews, Bertolucci actually, talking about the film, he said, well, yeah, Verdi is my father here. And so we have to think about, what that would mean, and what does it mean then to betray that father as well. But the citations from Verdi are from Ballo and Maschera, but most importantly, Rigoletto, and we could even have a long conversation about how, why Rigoletto and, what the plot does, And then, of course, also painting, and it's hard to miss the many, many citations of Magritte, of course, René Magritte, and, the one sort of mise en scène after the other, but also Di Chirico, in the shots of the town of Tara. But Tara itself is a citation both from the Irish, the seat of Irish kings, but it's also, of course, Tara as in Gone with the Wind, so there's a kind of cinematic intertext. And I think, Massimo, you're going to talk a lot about cinematic quotes. I think, Anyway, so here's a question that comes up. One could sleuth one's way through this film and say, oh, this is this, and this is a quote from this, but what then happens is that it's almost as if we then become part of the film, right? Because that is exactly what Athos Jr. is doing, right? he keeps trying to find, you know, the quotes, and then has a kind of ambiguous relationship to it. He says, well, oh, this has already been pre-written, you know, they're just giving me scripts, and I recognize the script, and Dreyfus as well. It looks like you've read a lot of books. And so, you know, what does this mean, you know, when we interpret the film by you know, chasing down all of these citations? And then finally, and then related to the citation, you know, stuff, is of course the question of theatricality, which is central to the film, but it's also, you know, theatricality has been central to analyses of fascism and the recurring, let's call it accusation that fascism is mere theater. And that it is performative, and now that could mean what it's usually meant is that it doesn't go deep. You know, it is just a citation, but it's not. But it doesn't really have a profound impact on the culture. But here, you know, what Bertolucci is raising is the possibility that anti-fascism is equally theatrical. And, you know, I mean, the lines by Athos Sr. at the very end, when he stands with his back to us, looking over Tara and says, you know, Tara will become a theater. The entire city and all of its inhabitants will participate in the play, even if they don't know it. And so you know, the possibility that if, you know, fascism was theatrical, well then so is also anti-fascism. So I'll stop there, and
Great,
yeah.
yes. Okay, yes, I want to ask Massimo something. But Suzanne, I want to just follow up on one little thing, that you, not one little thing, one large thing that you said. Because it's very easy for us to sort of like do our conversation, and suddenly an hour is up and we haven't answered the crucial question. You asked, does the film propose a way out of the problem? Would you just mind just giving us, very briefly, your answer to that?
You know what? I don't know. I mean, that's really. But the problem is, and I mean that seriously. It's not that I'm just shrugging it off. Is I actually think that that Bertolucci. That is Bertolucci's point too. Yeah. In other words, when I say I don't know, I think that Bertolucci doesn't know, and which then just leads to, you know, it's like another wrap around the body, you know, when she wraps him in the bandage. It feels, you know, so I mean, I have a reading of the ending where I have two readings of the ending. One where there's no way out, and one where there is, you know. So, and the way I see a way out, and I mean, this is what I've written about, is the interpretation of how I would read the scene in the opera house. And it's a very, very strange, it's really beautifully filmed, and it's extremely complicated, and one would have to take it, you know, literally sort of frame by frame. But what I find interesting is this kind of weird moment where the show is going on, the theater is going on the stage, right, the Rigoletto performance, and we don't see that. And there's this moment of a kind of off-seenness that I think allows for a moment where one could kind of think about getting out of this kind of theatrical citation thing by a kind of, you know, moment of non-representation.
Yeah, I like the way you phrased it. I mean, because the problem is to get out of citation, isn't it?
That's exactly right.
And so, and also the film sets up the problem in certain ways. So
yeah.
we will talk about these kind of structural questions, and we'll make sure we come back to those. Massimo, maybe we could move to you. I mean, I think you were already thinking about bringing this for cinema ritrovata before we started talking about film thinking. So this really has been a collaborative venture.
Absolutely, I'm very glad that we did, because this film was, as I said, restored recently, as Suzanne was saying, and had practically disappeared from circulation, except for copies that were clearly not up to the the value of the film, because this is a film in which color and the shades of the Magrittian blue, but also other, the vivid colors of the Alida and Matt Painter, this great naive painter, based on a book that was actually edited by Cesare Zavattini, which is interesting, because another Emilian, so we are in Emilia as a context, as I was saying at the beginning. The spirit of the place is really what pervades and inspires this film, also in its political dilemmas, enigmas, and but what I wanted to do is something a little or slightly, because you actually set up perfectly the real questions that this film poses. That is the political question, the political, psychological, political, in the sense of a theme of treason, and if you wish, the internal struggles of the Italian left, precisely at that moment, not throughout the decade. I'll get back to that, but I wanted to just put on the table a few observations, belonging to the genre games that cinephiles play, and so things that I've noticed as a movie buff, and having gone to the Cineteca and Cinema Ritrovata Festival many years now, so I have this a little bit of a database, etc. So some things are quite obvious. For instance, the film opens with a train arriving at Tara Station. It doesn't really open with that. Opens with a panning shot on the trees. There is a double citation there. The first citation is from Pasolini's Oedipus Rex. It's the same, the birth of the child. But then the panning shot turns to this archetypal establishing shot, which is clearly a quotation of the Lumière, the arrival of the train, but inverted direction. Not inverted direction. Instead of right to left, left to right. We could elaborate, but I leave it up to you to come out perhaps with some explanations. Of course, the reference with the local trains of the Po River Valley that I mentioned at the beginning, trains that never leave on time, never arrive, and so on and so forth. So we go back. This is clearly the circular structure of this film, from the establishing shot. Perhaps the history of film of the cinema is also implicated in this, in what Pasolini is trying to say. Second point, or clue or prompt, Tara, or the spirit of the place. As Suzanne said, Tara does not exist. Tara is in fact Sabbioneta, a metaphysical setting worthy of Giorgio de Chirico, yet cinematically speaking, that Tara exists, not only because this film puts it on the map, but because it is the name of the plantation in Gone with the Wind, named after the hill of Tara, etc., etc. So it's perhaps Bertolucci's nod to Jorge Luis Borges, with the theme of the traitor and the hero, which is set in Ireland. The Borges writes with Poland, the Venetian Republic, some South American or Balkan state. In the case of Bertolucci, however, Tara, with all its Hollywoodian echo, can only be the heart of the Po River Valley, the cradle of neorealism and the birthplace of fascism. And in Italian, the word Tara also means something else, means ancestral taint or stigma. So I put it there, I'll offer it to you, take it away. If the American Civil War provided a backdrop to Gone with the Wind, the long Italian Civil War, from the rise of fascism in 1922 to the partisan uprising in 1945, is the backdrop of Strategia. And not only of Strategia, also of Novecento, of course. Second, I jumped to that, was my fifth point, but I'll jump to that because Dreyfus' Enchanted Farmhouse, and I'll go back to Dreyfus in a moment, will become the setting of the first part of Novecento, released in 1976. It's the same house, which is, as we said at the beginning, only a stone's throw from Bertolucci's place in the country. So 1900, released in 1976, I don't know if you have seen, is the year in which Bertolucci becomes a member of the Italian Communist Party. Perhaps as a result of his psychoanalysis that started in 1970. This is a joke, but perhaps as a solution to his personal problems, it becomes and produces this film, which is the story of the half brothers or mortal frenemies. If you remember, the son of the Padrone, played by Robert De Niro, and the bastard son of the peasant's household, played by Gérard Depardieu, and this long saga family with their love stories with Dominique Sanda and Stefania Sandrelli, re-exhumed from another tale of double betrayal, the Conformists, a Strategia's twin film. So Novecento also starts Burt Lancaster in the role of the patriarch of the country estate that once was Tara. But so Novecento is interesting because, and this goes back to what Suzanne was saying, because it marks Bertolucci's move to what we could call an international popular, not the national pop, the international popular, Gramscian Hollywoodian aesthetic, a kind of Gone with the Wind meets Reds, that eventually won him an Oscar in 1987 with The Last Emperor. In the same year, as I said, Novecento was released, Bertolucci joined the PCI, the PC, the Communist Italian Party, and his dedication of Strategia to the Regione Emilia, la Regione Rossa, the heart of the Communist Party, historically, not anymore, unfortunately, but of course, then also makes sense, makes sense and completes his return home, as I said, before the revolution. It was his first film shot in Parma, and however, also Novecento opens on the notes of Rigoletto. Ah, la maledizione! No, sorry. Now, if I can go back quickly to Dreyfus, just to complete, because Dreyfus, of course, she says her name is inspired of the affair Dreyfus, her father named her. And I have another theory about this, but I won't share it now, maybe later if you're curious. I can tell you there is another, perhaps more twisted way to this, to understand why Dreyfus. But with such an operatic name, Dreyfus is clearly a sorceress. She's a descendant of such mythical figures as Homer's Circe and more local varieties of the Po River Valley, such as Ariosto's Alcina and Tasso's Armida. And of course, Armida was also immortalized by Rossini. Dreyfus clearly belongs to the Verdi repertoire, with the likes of Ulrica in Maschera and Azucena in El Trovatore, perhaps even the Witches of Macbeth, and so on and so forth. But Dreyfus embodies the spirit of the place, or the spell of the place. And her spell is the reincarnation of her lover. Whether it's a spell that, at the end explains what's happening to others or not, that's another question. Cinematically speaking, as a flashback turned into a temporal loop, which is exactly that circular, so in which time present and time past are both perhaps present, etc., etc. So that would explain. And I think the last thing, perhaps the cinéma vérité of memory, going back to what Bertolucci said, or I would say the Uranian chamber, so the culatello as Bertolucci's Madeleine, much tastier, as I would say. But so the Magritte-inspired Twilight Blue gives the film its psychological shade. I mean, it's this very hard to obtain. Storaro, they filmed, 40 minutes before or between sunset, etc. Yet the widely colored imagery of the naive painter Bewes, as we said, completes the palette. The result, the lush countryside of the Po River Valley as a metaphysic, oniric, and primordial jungle, where political Oedipal dramas play out and real and symbolic murders are committed, covered, and uncovered. So Bertolucci notoriously said that psychoanalysis was another lens on his camera, no? But the sequence in the Uranian chamber, and this is my prompt, and make it whatever you like, the Curatello room, etc., with the rhythmic opening and closing of the camera lens, this fade out that are not exactly fade ins, fade out, etc., could be considered, this is my opinion, both the most and the least Godardian moment of the film, and both together. And so this is another possible attempt. But there is no director more anti-Godardian than Godard. Sorry, that's very interesting. Not than Bertolucci, but clearly this is something that can be explored. So last, Alcina, Armida, Dreyfa, Alida. Alida Valli, born in Pola in Dalmatia, the daughter of an Austrian aristocrat, had a successful career during fascism, often compared to Marlene Dietrich, Greta Garbo. Mussolini liked her very much and called her the most beautiful woman in the world. Her major roles as femme fatale before Strategia include Maddalena Anna Paradine in The Paradine Case, directed by Hitchcock, Anna Schmidt in The Third Man, directed by Carol Reed, and most importantly for us, the Venetian Countess Livia Serpieri in Visconti's Risorgimento Melodrama-Senso. A decadent tale of double betrayal, championed by the PCI, the Communist Party Intelligentsia, as a Gramscian masterpiece at the 1954 Venice Film Festival, in opposition to La Strada and Fellini. That was clear. So, if you remember, in Sensos, Livia betrays the Italian independence cause because of her mad love for a debauched Austrian deserter. I would add another role, though, that Valli played right before. She was Oedipus' stepmother, Merope, in Pierpaolo Pasolini, Oedipus Rex, released in 1964. So, Bertolucci began his career as Pasolini's assistant director at age 17 on the set of Acatone. Cinematically speaking, with his psychoanalytical brand of operatic, melodramatic neorealism, Bertolucci can be considered both Pasolini's and Visconti's stepson. The casting of Alida, Livia, Merope as Dreyfa makes perfect sense.
Okay, thank you, Massimo. So much to think about and a lot to come back to. So I would like us to do that. Ben, I think of you as a great ideology critic of literature and film also, and I wonder whether some of what Massimo has been saying leads us onto this question of this film in particular. Bertolucci at one point said that movies are made of the same material as dreams, and I'm wondering what your take on this film has been.
Thanks, Tim. I guess I'll disappoint you. I think I'll start by being a big old fascist and talk about citational things. There were some citations I wanted to pick up. First of all, to say thank you for inviting me. This is wonderful to see on a big screen. I watched it to prepare for this in like the worst possible transfer, which I could barely see or hear anything, and it's really like a discovery for me. Thank you for all these insights. I'm very annoyed to have to go last after so many brilliant things have been said. About the citations, something that struck me, and hopefully this will lead up to my other points, is one of my favorite films is a movie that Bertolucci came up with the story for with Dario Argento a couple years before this, called Once Upon a Time in the West. And on top of the citations you've mentioned, this is a a film where a stranger comes to town on the train. That's the first shot of the film. Charles Bronson arrives, throws out his luggage, and the movie ends with the train being built in the West and going out west. So it's another parallel train structure. And also a sort of mystery, revenge plot. And I know that in preparing to write this Western, Bertolucci and Argento watched all of the Westerns, all of the Hollywood Westerns before this. And another, there's trains and a lot of these things. Another movie that occurred to me as having very similar structure and being perhaps citational is a movie called Bad Day at Black Rock with Spencer Tracy as a karate chopping, one-armed man who arrives in town to solve this murder mystery and does, and then leaves. You know, he has the proverbial bad day, or I guess everyone else has the bad day, and he leaves having brought out the truth. And this seems to be not the structure of this film, although it cites these things and it has that basic structure in some way. But both Spencer Tracy and Charles Bronson and these other hopping off a train to solve a mystery and getting back on and leaving movies, the characters are essentially nobodies. Spencer Tracy is ignored as who is this old one-armed man. Charles Bronson is one of these Western heroes without a name. And that is very much differently at issue in this film. So Athos Magnani he's too much of a somebody. It's a very different structure. He's too much of a somebody, and yet that also is a problem. Insofar as how is he going to draw his identity differently from his father? He's playing dress up at some point with this very fetching look that has been kept for him. And it's been mentioned several times, the film also, for this reason, has this Oedipus Rex structure where the investigator finds himself implicated in the crime. And this is what the more classical feel-good Westerns that I mentioned don't have, which is the hero is allowed to extricate themselves and get on the train at the end and leave. You don't have that here. So that's just a citational point going through Bertolucci back to some Westerns that may have influenced him. The three questions I have lined up, I'll try to move through these quickly, are one, what is the point of the changes that Bertolucci makes to the Borges story? The theme of the traitor and the hero? Maybe it's the other way. Point two, what is the meaning of the title? Because he doesn't call his film that. He calls it the Spider Stratagem. And the third question, then how does Bertolucci think all these implications on film? And I'll move through these fairly quickly and leave them as open as I can. So one major difference from the Borges story is that for Borges, it's, as was mentioned, it takes place in Ireland in 1824. The narrator's name is, or not the narrator, the hero's name is Ryan. He's the great-grandson, big difference, of the assassinated Fergus Kilpatrick. And Bertolucci makes, and the case is solved by this aesthetic literary detective work. And Hegel is involved in some way, and Leibniz. Now Bertolucci does something very different. He sets the story only some 36 years before, so that all the characters involved are still present in the cover-up. And that is very the sense of the past is not past, motif. That's added by Bertolucci. That's not in the Borges story. For Borges, this is a literary, dusty manuscript somewhere. And for Bertolucci, it's a problem of living memory and living falsification and the sense that one can get re-involved in all of this. It's very interesting on this point, the bizarre way that all the flashbacks have the actors, these old people, playing younger versions of themselves. And it's not that they had to wait for Scorsese to de-age people the way we see with Joe Pesci in The Irishman. He could simply have, and ought simply to have cast younger people. It's a definite decision to cast, to just continue having people playing 30, 36 years earlier versions of themselves. Okay, that's the Borges point. Although I would also mention about this, there's another Borges story that's very close to this theme called Three Versions of Judas, which is in the same vein. It's not really a story. It's a sort of, and the theme of the traitor and the hero is not a story. He begins by saying, I had an idea for a story. What if it was like this? Should it take place in Poland? Maybe it should take place in Ireland. Let me invent it. It's not really a tale that he tells. And Three Versions of Judas is the same thing. It's presented in that way. And the idea is perhaps Judas, in betraying Christ, was really the authentic protagonist, God incarnate, perhaps. There's three versions. I won't go through them all. But it's the same idea of protagonist as traitor, assigned in this case to Judas. Now, the second point is, so what is the meaning of the title? What does Bertolucci do with this? What we see in the film is that meaning is determined only retroactively, and I think importantly, collectively. The apotheosis of Athos is done, and has to be continually done. I think seems to be the point. It's not a one-off thing. Just the murder doesn't do it. Just the one bust doesn't do it. Another plaque probably won't do it. The speech won't do it. It has to continually be reasserted retroactively and collectively. But it involves a kind of lure, and it's asserted by Athos Jr., I guess, Fils, that there's a discrepancy or a failure built into it, a sort of flaw that's, and this is in the Borges story, that is to be discovered in order to require its repetition, so that the detective, entraps himself in this way, and this I think is the trap of the spider in the title. So the circular aspect that has been pointed out necessarily involves recruiting or drawing on new blood to keep going. So it's interesting that the lie itself is not sufficient. It has to be repeated, sacrificially or ritualistically, whatever you want to say about this. Now, the implication of all this to me, and this is, no, I'll go back to it. The implication of all this to me is that there's a kind of formal fascism in this collective theatrical murder and in this repetition that has, although this is an open question, an anti-fascist content. And then the question that I think is raised is, well, can those things be separated? It was mentioned in the opening remarks that fascism could be condemned for being contentless in the first place. So interesting, everyone in the town behaves as if they were about to string this guy up for poking his nose into things. The fascists, the lingering ex-fascists, whatever, behave as if, officially they want him to leave, even though it's not their lie. So he says, we wish that we had killed your father. Someone else scooped us on this, basically. And then the purported anti-fascists, although they say we didn't really know how to be anti-fascists in the first place, they want him to stay and to trap him there as a way to perpetuate this. So that's the second question about the title and the thematics. And the last thing I wanted to say is just to point out some of the cinematic elements of this. It's very obvious the tracking shots are like, the train tracks going, not really going forward, but tracking backward. Just as often, you see this in the last shot of the film, when he reads the name of the street in the first arrival in town. It goes, for me, a very inconvenient direction to read. It goes right to left, and that theme, visual theme, is completely obvious, I think. It's very different from what you see in The Conformist. The Conformist has, speaking of Gone with the Wind, has these like very flowing wind-like shots, very low to the ground of leaves blowing, and the camera is sort of swelling and following with them. And this movie is much more on a track. I think much more, confined, circular. This is done very visually. There's an interesting shot when Athos is going past two men gesticulating and arguing with each other. They don't subtitle it, but I don't know what they're saying. He goes through them, and the movie breaks, one of the cinematic rules of the 180-degree rule. So that Kubrick breaks this, he's allowed to. But the Athos is advancing towards you, and then he passes through these men, and then there's a reverse angle where now we're watching his backside leaving. You're not supposed to do that, basically. It's a disorienting shot. And what it achieves is essentially a kind of mirroring, which is thematically pertinent, and sort of doubling back of the film image on itself. I think it's very interesting. My notes are very messy. I just wanted to add one more thing about the fascism aspect. There's two important quotes that I thought we could discuss. One is that Dreyfus says, ever since this happened, it's all been a facade. So that the history since this assassination has been, a mere presentation, a facade. And then there's a quote, one of the fellow conspirators quotes Athos Sr. in saying that by this point, fascism is ingrained in the people. And that seems an open question, maybe I've tipped my hand too much about it, that the goal of their whole project of killing him in the theater is to undo that. Fascism is ingrained in the people, therefore we must act this way. And it's not clear how successful they are in disingraining fascism at that point. Okay, those are my
That's great, Ben. Thanks all three of you. Actually, I think we should really open things up to the audience. So we do have two mics roving, one being carried by Ben, one being carried by Gregory. So we'd really be interested in your questions. I'm sure there are many. It's such an enigmatic film, and there are. I have myself. I could ask you now 3 or 4 questions, just simply about the way that the whole film is set up. So please do raise your hand, and if you want to ask a question, then wait for the microphone to be passed to you. And we can't see anything, so Ted, go ahead.
It's Ted.
So my take on this, thank you for organizing this. It's really so wonderful to see. Is twofold. One is it seems like a fever dream to me, and I wonder whether that was an interpretation that's in the literature somewhere, because the first tell was when he gets off the train and there's no one there, and then all of a sudden the porter, who's weirdly dressed, handles his bag in a strange way. So it's almost for me like the whole thing is a dream, a Hotel California type dream, which is about the same period. And I wonder whether other people thought that. But he has a dream on a bench, and that's sort of the whole movie. But what else I want to say about it is that it's so precisely shot. And it was beautiful use of the z-axis and then the x-axis. And the only tilt in the movie is the last one, the last shot. You know that? which is another signal.
Did you say going to filter? Did you say?
Sorry?
Well, to tilt.
Yeah, I mean, there are lovely pans and tracking shots, but I think that's the only tilt, which is another signal. So, elaborating on that point, it was so hard to do what he did in 1970. And it's remarkable that he could maintain that precision throughout the whole film. Because now it would be done in post-production, and he did it organically.
Yeah, that would be Storado's, you know. Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, the stuff about dream, I mean, there's lots of literature on, you know, the dream structure of this film, which is, you know, really, really pronounced. Particularly as, you know, I mean, as Massimo earlier mentioned, this was the year of intense psychoanalysis for Bertolucci and also a very, I think, intense, you know, reading of Freud. And this shows up both in this film and also in The Conformist, where it's probably even, you know, it's practically thematized. Here it's much more sort of structural. And Ben mentioned earlier the scene of it's also a kind of Magritte, you know, framing of when he arrives in the town and then the camera goes backwards, reading via Athos Magnani, right? Athos Magnani Road, if you will. You know, there's lots of interpretation of that as, you know, this is literally dream analysis, you know, Freudian dream analysis, you know, which is going backwards into the unconscious, and, you know, the royal road to the unconscious, which are dreams, and then these continuous structures of displacement and condensation that go on in the film, and this undoing of dichotomies, right? So the whole question of gender is a really problematic, you know, thing in this film. But, you know, the whole thing about the rabbit, is it a girl or is it a boy? Or, you know, when he thinks it's a boy and then she's painting her nails and shows that she's a girl, but day and night where it's not clear. I mean, you have to have the rooster, you know, the fake rooster call to make it day, and you know, and so there's this, you know, this question of whether one is awake or dreaming, you know, throughout. And so I would kind of be hesitant about saying that the whole thing is just a dream, and that is because I think then we really do lose the political import of the film. And so I think one has to sort of say, okay, you know, but it's also real. You know, we're also awake.
Anna, did you have a question?
Thank you. I have a kind of just a brief question about the idea of transmission. You know, this is kind of across all of your talks about kind of the cinema of memory, for example. I think, Ben, one difference you didn't mention from the Borges story to the film is actually the figure of Nolan in the Borges story, who is actually the person who transmits the story of Fitzpatrick, I believe is the name. I guess in this film it's slightly different because Atnos Sr. is actually the one who takes charge of narrating the story himself. Whereas if it was a kind of direct translation of the Borges, the three comrades, in a sense, would be the one transmitting the story. So I was just wondering what you guys make of those three figures of his kind of crew, in a sense, and what the difference is by putting the narrative agency, in a sense, in Athos Sr.'s hands. Thank you.
Well, I don't have a direct answer about that, but I think, as I said, the Borges story doesn't have such a plot. I mean, it's not really a story, as I was saying. And in order to, to make it into a somewhat suspenseful, if you found it that way, film, narrative, Bertolucci has to create two clues, twists, I guess, that enable Athos Jr. to solve or stumble upon the truth in a different way than in the Borges story, which is obsessed with literary transmission, and is quite apolitical in so far as Bertolucci's film is much more political for these reasons, I think. And the clues are interesting. One is the assassination by Rigoletto. He's because Athos Jr. sort of has this hunch or whatever, light bulb going off his head, which is, isn't it interesting that you planned to assassinate Mussolini during Rigoletto and my father was killed instead? Only you 3 or 4 could have known this. And at that point, the outdoor cinema owner is like, yeah, you gave me a funny look about that. That's one thing. And then he says, and I think this is the key. Not the key question, but it touches on the questions I was raising earlier. When Athos is talking to Dreyfus, he says, they were all telling the truth, but it seemed arranged. And he says, why did they have to get their story straight if it was true, which I take it to be. And I think those are the imploding aspects that Bertolucci adds. Those aren't in the story because they're more political, I think, than the literary transmission aspect that you brought.
But maybe we could push a little bit further on this, because we've all sort of agreed, well, this is a political film, it's more political than the Borges story. But I think there isn't there a tension between what are the politics of this film? This is what I really have a lot of difficulty in grasping myself. I mean, there is also this formal problem at the heart of the film. Why does Athos Senior betray in the first place? Given that he's not a real fascist, he then subsequently conspires to present himself as a hero to the revolution. So what is his motivation? He's asked that 3 times during the film. Each time the subject has changed, and we don't have an answer to it. So this seems to me a flaw in the film, and the film is very much about formal flaws. I remember the conversation earlier on about how a wine is better if it tastes a bit woody, and a man also should have a flaw in it. And this film seems to me to have a formal flaw in the very readiness with which it offers itself up to a kind of political analysis. So I'm wondering if we could just maybe push a bit further at this question.
Well, I think this so. Ben, you actually kind of said it earlier in your comments, which is you talked about a necessary flaw, and that is what's so interesting. In other words, the legend can only go on and be reiterated over and over again if there's a flaw in the story. Otherwise, it can't be retold, right? And which is really interesting, right? And I think that brings us back to Tara. I mean, the flaw. There is a fundamental flaw, I think, at the very heart of it. I mean, I had even thought that maybe he betrayed so that he could die as a hero. Right, and this was all an elaborate plot on his part to become a hero, which he couldn't have done otherwise, right? But I still think it's the sort of narrative machine that is that in this film. Yeah.
Can I add just a second? Just one observation. Who is the narrator really here? I mean, who tells the story? There are several levels. I mean, certainly. The camera tells the story. There's a script that has been sort of questioned at the same time as it is executed, and there are several stories going on. So this is the interesting thing. So this creates the kind of questions about the coherence. There is no coherence because this is a myth that is being built. So it's not necessarily a story that makes sense. It's a story that has the purpose of becoming, retrospectively, its meaning. In other words, the hero has to be a traitor in order to be a hero, and the traitor has to be a hero in order to be a traitor. So this is fascinating to me because this is exactly why this film is actually prophetic of the history of the Italian left in the 1970s, if you think. Because, this, I mentioned the civil war within the Italian left. At some point, Bertolucci had this quote that probably won't make sense to many of you, but he said, well, Athos Jr. for me is Berlinguer, and Athos Senior is Togliatti. And for those, going back to what Suzanne was saying before, so the new Communist Party, the son, is the one who betrays the father, who is the Stalinist Togliatti, who had devised this strategy, the long march of the Communist Party through the institutions toward hegemony. And Berlinguer is the one who reworked this in a social democratic way. And so that's seen as a betrayal. Bertolucci, his point, that's the heart of the political betrayal. But who is being betrayed here? I would assume, and my interpretation is that who is really the father being betrayed is Antonio Gramsci. And I say this because Gramsci is a profoundly contested, political figure in Italy, and the legacy of Gramsci is highly contested. The Gramsci of the Ordine Nuovo is the Gramsci that inspired the revolution in the 19th, the Leninist Gramsci of the Gramsci workerist, the operaista Gramsci is really the myth, or if you wish, the theoretician of the left of the Communist Party. The Gramsci of the Quaderni, of the notebooks from the jail, is the Gramsci of Togliatti, the Gramsci shaped by Togliatti, and is the Gramsci of the National Popular, etc. Bertolucci first prophesied this idea that the Italian left there is this internecine, this fratricidal war within the left, and that takes the side of the Communist Party. So he's taking the side of Berlinguer, of Athos Jr. And this is the story he's telling already without knowing in this film, in my opinion. He will tell it in 5 hours of Novecento as this feuilleton for the masses that he will do, which is going to be his attempt to embrace the idea of the national popular. So I don't know if this makes a lot of sense, but I think that's the political, crucial aspect. As far as the Western, there is a Western quote that you haven't quoted. It's The Last Sunset. It's that in the poster, it's supposed to be the Italian title with Kirk Douglas, Rob Hudson, and Joseph Cotten.
It has a different title.
Different title. The Italian title I forgot.
Something swollen.
See, something like. But that film is fascinating because it is a film in which the hero doesn't escape. In fact, there are antagonists. But there is also an incest feature in that film. One of Robert Aldrich, I forgot the name, the year, etc. But fascinating because incest is another element that we haven't mentioned. So there is the trace of the typical element, but incest is very much incestuous relationship within the Italian society. The Civil War is, as I said, fascism, anti-fascism, but within the left also this, compulsion to repeat this archetypal element, and this is exactly what Bertolucci is saying.
Ben, you also had something to say about this.
The slightest thing to say about the hero and traitor theme, which is there's a personal dimension to it as well, which is, let's say, a trade-off in becoming a local or national anti-fascist hero. It's not only that the son discovers that his father is really a traitor, he also discovers that he's an ass throughout. I mean, the personal dimension. What do we see about leaving aside the politics, and this is my way of answering your question about the politics, what do we see if we take out the politics of this film that the son discovers about the father? Nothing good, I think. And
So nothing good then about the politics of the film. I mean, it's quite a devastating analysis. I don't see a particularly progressive political agenda in this film, I have to say.
Well, like, you know, so no, but you know, but here's the, you know, the problem is that is the progressive political agenda undone when one airs one's dirty laundry, right? And I mean, that is sort of the question of this film, right? And you know, I think that the left by you know after '68 was caught with his pants down, right? And there was just nowhere you could go, you know, no position that you could take it without being trapped into this.
But Bertolucci has constructed that parallel through a false, or rather an empty gesture at the beginning, i.e. Athos's senior, implausible betrayal, stroke. This is both a traitor and a hero, and that is an artificial construct that he's used in order to tell this elaborate parable of airing your dirty laundry. The problem is that the very gesture at the beginning is an implausible one.
Yeah.
I mean, anyway, that's what. But I don't want to have the last word because I'm in charge. So can we just have maybe one last question?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, this is taking us away from this, you know, whole thing that you've been just discussing. But I love when a film allows people from different lenses of disciplinary lenses to really plug in. And I love the film. I just saw it this afternoon in preparation for tonight, and then wow, yeah, big screen. It's amazing it was made for TV, but this is stunning. And I really appreciate that Bertolucci helped me to see some artists in ways that I never had before, because I think we undersell his references to painters, because there are many, many painters referenced in this film, many. And the fact that he begins with that artist in opening credits, or not the credits, but the opening, that particular artist, I think, is really important for his point of this film. The Surrealists had a reputation for holding some really anti-fascist members of the Surrealist movement and some real fascist members of the Surrealist movement. And I think throughout running the theme that that there's a simultaneity of the hero traitor, that both you see so many shots of people from front and then back, or one side and then the other side, so that you're always, there's a kind of constant repetition. I wanted to mention to this gentleman that there is a place in the camera work that really shocked me. And that was when he goes to leave town finally at the train station. And then he keeps going. You see him from the town side of the train station through the window, and then the train side, and it keeps flipping back and forth, back and forth. And then there's a shot up to two lights, street lights, and some trees, some foliage. And the camera all of a sudden is handheld. It's not fixed. And it was a moment that I thought was just brilliant. So I think what you're saying about the camera tilt only happening at the end, there were some key places in that film where the camera got off the compositional grid, and they were really important, and I'd like to go back and look at where they occurred. Now, there's also, I think, a gendered piece in terms of the imaging of, you talked so much about the importance of gender there. And the whole mythology that women had this kind of emotional passion for fascism. When the group is hearing that Mussolini's coming to town, and the woman, and there's this long shot of her close-up face, wordless, right? All the men are talking. This woman has a kind of Saint Teresa of Lisieux, in ecstasy. And then there's a woman's image, a holy woman in the barn, in the dark, when he strikes the match. These wordless women who seem to have this, can I say, animal understanding of what is not rational. That also is a myth in the fascist narrative that I think is really important. So looking at all the artist quotes, I'll finish by saying, Bertolucci helped me to understand that Georges de la Tour, with the cupped hand around the match, that's a Georges de la Tour painting. And he helped me see that Georges de la Tour was a precursor of Surrealists. And I thank him for that.
Interesting, the painting that he discovers in the barn is Antonella Messina. Yeah. But Antonella Messina not but covered, so it's very interesting also the way it's framed, hidden inside the wall. What Antonella Messina is doing in the barn, of course, it's to bring more. This is a dream, so perhaps it makes sense. There are
the reference to the painting of Arles, where you have the field and then the town in the distance, and the way that the fields represented a lack of that symmetrical architectural composition of all those shots. When you see, even in the villa, the way the foliage becomes this jungle-like environment, like Rousseau,
Yeah, absolutely. But that brings me back to the fundamental question whether the political and the dream structure of the film, or the camera work, if you want, and if you wish, and the political narrative really can keep together. I don't think so. I think that there is really there's an attempt to tell a story that makes sense politically, but in fact there are many elements that undermine that. And there is a fascinating quote from Pasolini's The Ashes of Gramsci in 1954 that brings up the theme of treason. And I want to, because of course Pasolini, Bertolucci was 17 when he started. He says he saw the cinema being invented by Pasolini, or reinvented by Pasolini. That's how. And he, Pasolini, if you remember, addresses, these are famous. I'm sure our students know them by heart, but Pasolini addresses Gramsci's ashes, and this way: the shame of contradicting myself, of being with you and against you, with you in my heart, in truth against you in my dark inmost feelings, traitor to my father, and in thought, in a shadow of action. Frankly, I think that in a nutshell, there is really this idea, and the traitor to my fatherland is also the hero of the fatherland. And this is the paradox that is trying to. So I guess trying to make political sense of this film is hard from a narrative point of view. There are many levels, but certainly there is a fundamental tension.
Okay, well, we are definitely out of time. I do want to thank everybody for coming out this afternoon, but especially want to thank my guests and panelists, Suzanne, Massimo, and Ben, for their insights. Really given us so much to have on this one.
What a pleasure. Thank you.